I just want to move on to how we can prevent abusive leadership. And at one level, just some suggestions here as to how we sort of do that. And I think this is hugely important for us as leaders to make sure that we do not become abusive ourselves and that we don't create cultures and structures that are abusive. And a number of kind of obvious, or not obvious, a number of important steps to this. It seems to me, first of all, leaders have a responsibility to guard themselves. You can never, in a sense, totally sort of ensure that a leader does not become abusive if they themselves are not kind of guarding themselves and preventing themselves from becoming a sort of abusive. So a large measure of self-guard is important. So a number of elements to that. I think maintaining a close devotional walk with the Lord. Most leaders who've become abusive, actually at some point along the line, their relationship with Jesus has declined, and they are no longer reading his word, praying, engaging as a member of the church community, being a disciple and a follower, as we thought in the first session. And actually their own personal spiritual life is deficient. And I think for all leaders, that is of crucial significance. Actually maintaining our own spiritual walk is the primary defense against becoming abusive. If we are reading the Bible, if we are praying honestly, if we are engaging in the church community with other people, at one level that is a multiple defense against becoming abusive, because we will constantly be being kind of rebuked, corrected, trained, transformed by what we read and hear in God's word. I think for many of us who are leaders, sitting under the word as it's preached by other people is really important. I think, again, as pastors and teachers, you can be the person who's always doing the speaking but never doing the hearing. And actually, we need to have the word preached to us so that we ourselves are being kind of shaped by that. So I think cultivating a close devotional walk with the Lord. Part of this is our constant battle in the Christian life to resist temptation. So we need to recognise that we are tempted. And I think all of us need to be self-aware enough to know where our particular points of temptation are. So each of us will be different. Each of us will be tempted by different things. We need to be especially on guard against the things that are more tempting for us, and to pay special care to temptation. And part of that is personal accountability and friendships, having others who will hold us to account, with whom we are open and transparent, who can ask us difficult questions, who can observe our lives and will be prepared to step in if they see things amiss. And particularly that needs, I think, people who are on the inside of our lives, not just simply seeing our public ministry. In other words, they're the people who see behind what happens in public, so that we're not just pulpit or platform performers. It's the people who can see the way we speak to our wives, the way we speak to our children, the way we kind of behave in social interactions with other Christians in ordinary contexts. Now, none of that is foolproof, because actually, even if you have personal accountability relationships, manipulative leaders can, in a sense of sort of play those relationships in a way that it looks like they're being accountable, but they're not really. But again, I think some measure of concern if people want no measure of accountability, and if they are essentially isolated and without friends. Again, I think that one of the characteristics of quite a lot of abusive leaders is, in the end, people sort of say, well, nobody was really close to them. They didn't really have friends. They had juniors who related to them, but actually not peers who were genuinely a friendship group. They're actually quite isolated. And that's a slightly worrying sign. Secondly, I think structures that guard leaders and the led. Good structure is crucially important, I think, for protecting leaders and those who are under their leadership. Again, I think you see that in the Bible. as churches are planted and established, as structures are put in place, those structures are actually there for both sides. They protect the leader, but they also protect the people that they are leading. And again, very often, abusive leadership occurs in contexts which become very informal. Often its informality creates a context in which abuse can take place. So a number of things from, for example, the pastoral epistles, which I think are full of this kind of stuff. Appropriate institutional structures are how are leaders appointed, making sure that the right people are appointed on the right basis. And actually the leadership criteria in the pastoral epistles is actually primarily character. Character is absolutely essential. And if structures don't seek to make character central, then again, that's opening the potential for abuse. I would say plurality is hugely significant, that leadership is not owned by single individuals, but it's actually shared across a group who have a mutual accountability to one another. And then some measure of accountability of the leaders, even the plural group of leaders beyond themselves. And how that works out actually depends on different structures for organisations or churches. So there isn't a set rule about that. In denominations, it might be an accountability to a denominational body or officer. In a congregational church, there's an ultimate accountability to the congregation. In organisations, it might be an accountability to the board who exercise that role. Whatever the sort of structure is, and some sort of inbuilt accountability. And all of those different models of accountability, they work in slightly different ways. They can be misused in different ways. The goal is, whatever it is, to make it work effectively so that there is some proper accountability. I mentioned 1 Timothy chapter 5. I think 1 Timothy 5 speaks of that accountability, that charges can be brought against, in that context, an elder, an overseer. There must be a mechanism by which the leaders can be accountable for their conduct and where it can be questioned, challenged, and assessed. So structures are key, and then I think policies and procedures that the organisation or the church has in order to in a sense, say how things should be done, and also what should be done if things are going wrong. So what does good pastoral practice look like in the church? So it's helpful to have policies and procedures, thinking in a church context for example, how does the male eldership or male pastors relate to women in the church? What are appropriate discipling relationships in that context? How do we see individual or small group ministry? What are the safeguards that are in place? Having a proper complaints procedure. Who do people go to if they have concerns or they believe they've been mistreated? Is there a clarity about how complaints can be brought and how they will be dealt with in an appropriate way? Because of the nature of particular kind of spiritual abuse and the misuse of power, a number of churches and organisations are beginning to adopt some kind of anti-bullying policy, something that recognises that imbalance of power. That's already present in very many workplaces, bullying and harassment. It's simply recognising that's actually quite good practice that can be included into the life of the church. And at a more serious level, safeguarding policies that make sure that people are not subject to physical or sexual abuse. So having thought about how people are expected to behave, and especially what you're going to do when things go wrong. Many organisations get caught out, particularly small informal organisations, when an allegation is raised and nobody has given any thought as to how it ought to be dealt with. Who is it reported to? How's it investigated? What steps need to be taken? Actually, the heat of having allegations is one of the worst times to try to work out how to do that. You need to have, in a sense, thought through what are the appropriate processes ahead of time. And I think this is all the sort of stuff that particularly entrepreneurial, pioneering leaders really hate, because it just feels like unnecessary bureaucracy. But actually, it's crucial to the long-term safety of organisations and churches. Again, I think it's really interesting that in the pastoral epistles, as the church grows and begins to be established, lots of energy is put into putting in place structures for exactly this purpose. And particularly entrepreneurial, kind of pioneering leaders, I think need particularly to recognise its importance for themselves. It will guard them and provide some parameters in which they can operate more safely. We've thought a little bit about what abusive leadership is. It naturally follows on from thinking about these policies and procedures that we need to put into place, is that if there are allegations of abuse that are raised, it's crucially important they're properly investigated and dealt with, and also that we provide care for victims who have been hurt. And in reality, this is a sort of a really difficult kind of area. This is the thing that in an organisation or a church you never want to have to do, but becomes a necessity if there are claims of abuse that are kind of made. So it's vital to be able to think about investigating sort of if allegations are made that a leader or a whole leadership team is acting abusively. Now, who investigates might depend upon the particular context. That'll be different if a church is part of, for example, a denominational body that investigates their churches. If it's an independent church, it may be a whole lot more complex as to who is due to investigate, because there might not be an outside body that has any authority over the church, and it's for the church itself to conduct an investigation. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 19 to 20, as I said, rather than Matthew 18, I think is the pattern here. What's really being raised is that charges, allegations are being brought against somebody in a position of authority, either within the church or the organisation. And I think that biblically there are a number of kind of key principles there as to what ought to be done for a proper kind of consideration of those charges. So it needs to be investigated independently. So the principle of right judgment, and this 1 Timothy 5 really draws on principles of judicial procedure biblically. It needs to be sort of, in a sense, investigated independently. In other words, a person doesn't investigate themselves. It needs some person who is sufficiently impartial to be able to judge what has happened. The process needs to be conducted openly. So it's not hidden, it's not secret. It's done in view of the community so that the community has confidence in what is decided. Decisions are made on the basis of evidence being provided. So 1 Timothy chapter 5 talks about sort of not entertaining allegations without adequate evidence. So evidence is crucially important. Don't act simply on the basis of allegation that is unsubstantiated. Now, 1 Timothy 5 talks about 2 or 3 witnesses. That is, I think that's something that we don't, again, I've seen misused with people saying, well, if there aren't 2 or 3 people who've seen this or whatever, then it can't be investigated. And that can become a way that abusers defend themselves. I think the underlying principle there is that there be adequate evidence on which to act. I don't think we should necessarily take that as prescriptive of how evidence is established. And in many cases, actually, because you've got a multiplicity of claims that are made, actually you have got 2 or 3 witnesses. They're not to the same incident, but they're to multiple incidents that build up an overall kind of pattern. But there's an appropriate considering of the evidence as allegations are corroborated. Then a decision needs to be made and an appropriate sort of explanation needs to be given. So again, 1 Timothy chapter 5, the charge is investigated and the conclusion is either it's found or it's not. Either there is evidence to support it or there isn't. And both the person who's complained and the wider community needs to, in a sense, have that explained. And if appropriate, action needs to be taken. So in 1 Timothy 5, if the leader is found to have sinned, they need to be rebuked. for their sin. This is not something that's just hidden and brushed under the carpet and they're allowed to quietly disappear. This needs to be properly dealt with within the life of the community. So there are a number of key principles there for investigating, and there are a growing number of agencies and organisations that will help churches to be able to undertake that sort of investigation. It can be very complex and costly, but I think it's vitally important that that is done. Obviously, caring for victims and not just sort of at the end of a process, but in the process as well. Those who've experienced abuse of this nature are often incredibly vulnerable, have been harmed. It's a traumatic experience for them to go through. Now, I usually find myself in the position of being involved in the investigation and having to sort of almost impartially look at the evidence of what's taken place. And actually, if you're the person investigating or with that responsibility, it's very difficult to be fully victim focused, other than in making sure that a fair investigation takes place that everybody hears. But I think it needs other people to then be able to support the victim in that process. And the kind of the complaints procedure needs to have ways in which those who are making complaints are supported. But it's very difficult for them to be supported by the same people who actually bear the responsibility of making the kind of the assessment and the judgment. And just a number of things that victims particularly need. They listening to their story, to what has happened, with a kind of an openness to hear their perspective, even if somebody feels that actually they've misunderstood, that this has impacted them in ways that it shouldn't have done. It's still vitally important to listen and hear what is being said rather than to simply be dismissive of it. Obviously, a proper investigation is crucial for the sake of the victim to know that what they've said has been taken seriously and properly considered. If it's found that the person has acted abusively, then the vindication of the victim, that's the element of rebuke. That's the public recognition that they have been mistreated. The person has behaved abusively in this situation, and obviously providing them with support. But then finally, the most difficult thing, I think, is in situations where you have claims that are made of abuse, but actually investigation doesn't uphold those claims. So actually there are sort of allegations that are made, but on sort of investigation, and I'm assuming here a fair and thorough process has been undertaken, it's concluded that abuse has not been exercised in this instance. And there might be a number of reasons why that is the case. It might well be that in actual fact there wasn't any abuse, so that it's been concluded that actually the person was mistaken, or there isn't really a case to answer here. And you might have the problem that the victim still feels that they have been abused, even if the process concludes that they haven't. There can be malicious accusations that people make. I think we need to recognise that can be a reality, that sometimes people can use allegations of abuse in a malicious way to undermine leaders. That's not impossible. Sometimes there are simply misunderstandings, that people have perceived the situation differently. And sometimes you are just left with a lack of evidence, that there is insufficient there to establish what took place. And at that point, I think we fall back on the biblical principle that you still have an innocent until proven to be guilty. We don't want to fall into a situation in which a person is presumed guilty simply because allegations are raised. But that is an incredibly difficult situation for all of the parties involved. I think the thing to say there is that actually we do live in an imperfect, fallen world in which we don't have a God's eye view. And even at a human level, the evidence of what's happened and what has taken place cannot always fully reveal the truth. And we have to live with that complexity of an imperfect world with an ultimate confidence that we have a God who knows everything, who will do justice in the end. So we try to do our best, but we recognise that sometimes the process will itself be flawed because of our lack of omniscience, if you want to put it in theological kind of terms. So that's a brief and quick kind of overview of some of the ways in which we can protect, put in place procedures and processes, and what needs to be done to investigate. Now, there's a growing body of literature and material that's available that speaks about this issue of abuse of power. I do recommend kind of Marcus's book, Powerful Leaders, which I think is really good. I think the other book, the one that I found most helpful to think about culture and how to have a healthy culture is Scott McKnight's book, A Church Called Tov, which to me has been the most helpful in terms of thinking about what does a healthy church culture look like. The language is a bit strange. Tov is the Hebrew word for good. So it's basically just saying, what does a good church culture look like? There are lots of things in that book that I think are really helpful to think through. How do we lead? What does an abusive culture look like? What does a good culture look like? But there is a growing range of materials that are available to you.